Alright, so we've got a ton of new info on Dune Awakening, the big new survival MMO that I'm kinda cautiously optimistic about. We've got more info thanks to a bunch of new live streams and also a new Q&A session with the dev team. Of course, you will also get a chance to try out the game yourself starting on May 9th, because as you may or may not know, Funcom is doing a beta weekend, and they were also kind enough to reach out and offer 20 beta keys to give away to you guys. So if you're interested in participating, leave a comment down below, as I'm trying to give these out in the next few days as quick as possible. In the meantime, there's also a link down below that you can follow if you want to check more about the game and wishlist it on Steam. That being said, we've got quite a few questions and answers on some of the more important topics, including base building, player auction house, also some of the story elements, plus multiplayer components. So one aspect that was talked about in the separate story video is that when it comes to the main story, you're not forced to follow it if you don't want to, though there are benefits in doing so. Besides story context, I mentioned before that after the character creation, you kind of get these two options. Either to go with the recommended tutorial, which pretty much teaches you the basics of the game, kind of gives you a more curated sort of progression path in the initial part of the story, where you kind of have limited access to schematics, but the ones that are most important to give you the basics, and then is when the game opens up. But you also kind of have the option to pretty much completely ignore the story, even right from the get-go. You can open up everything if you choose that option right there after the character creation, and just do your own adventure. This is probably more aimed towards veterans, or if you kind of already know your bearings and how to immediately go exactly for what you want to. And I will agree, after a couple of trial runs, I'm tempted to also go on the route that doesn't involve the main story. But at the same time, veterans who eventually get familiar with all of this will want maybe the option to just progress in their own journey without being curated and whatnot, which sounds like it benefits both styles of gameplay. However, there are many other ways you can interact with the overarching story, including some of the side quests we also talked about. For example, aligning yourself with certain factions, as well as tracking down the skill masters to eventually unlock other classes, will further give you context to what's happening, because this is an alternate version of the Dune franchise. So in this case, this is one of the things discussed. Another one was base building, which brings me to this subject because, as I've mentioned in the previous video, this felt robust and great in terms of its potential. However, I did express some concerns about possible points of friction that may cause your experience to become unnecessarily difficult. Mainly, I mentioned that the early game felt like it kind of forces you to constantly move and scrape old bases to get to closer areas, for example, ones that are closer to nearby story objectives or other points of interest. How you're forced of doing so quite often, and how in the process of doing this you're losing out quite a number of mats unless you're manually dismantling the base, which I felt kind of defeats the purpose of having a base in the first place. But Funcom was able to answer more about that, and it seems to be a feature by design. They want to actively encourage us to get rid of our old bases. Besides the limit of having maximum 3 bases at any given time, base power and taxes are another major aspect that plays into all of this. Mainly, what you need to know is that you have to generate power to your base, obviously, to power up all of the machineries you're going to have, like fabricators, recyclers, and everything that you use to craft and further improve your life in the game. But you also need that to upkeep your shields, because storms will absolutely destroy your base and eventually you will lose what's inside of it. So for that, you will need fuel cells. And while I'm not going to go in the full calculations of this, like one fuel cell equating to 1 hour of power round time, basically what they mention is that the strongest endgame generators right now available in the game will have the power of lasting for up to 1 month in game, give or take 1 week or so. And that means that at most, if you power up your base, you're going to have 1 month to come back and power it back again. Otherwise, you may run into troubles, including the one of it having it being destroyed because it has the shields running out. And that means that, for example, if you take a break longer than a month, say, for example, you're taking a, I don't know, spring or summer break and then want to come back at a later date, you may find yourself in the situation of having lost everything, because in your base, you typically deposit all of the resources you gathered, extra materials, items, gear, loot, and even some of the blueprints you might have discovered for later trade, you will lose them if this is going to continue and the shields break down and the base eventually deteriorates. Another aspect besides keeping the generators powered up is that you also have to pay taxes every 2 in-game weeks, which is a great way in and of itself to avoid economy hyperinflation in video games, and it's oftentimes used in MMOs specifically for this reason in one way or another. However, if you don't pay your taxes in-game or don't have the money for it, your base shields eventually get deactivated, putting you back in the same risky situation of losing everything eventually. Now, luckily, you do get 1 or 2 weeks of grace period, but again, this means that you're kind of forced into always checking out if everything is running smoothly, even if you don't plan on playing the game for an extended period of time, like I said, more than a month. And don't get me wrong, it is an interesting system that will likely not pose a problem in the first weeks or months of playtime when everybody flocks in the servers, but what happens 6 months or 1 year later down the line when the player base inevitably dwindles, like it's in the case of literally every single game. Now, another aspect they've talked about on a more positive note is that from a gameplay loop perspective, bases seem expandable and easy to recreate, and that is because the game features a blueprint mechanic that lets you copy the layout of a base so that you don't have to literally build it from scratch wall by wall. So this means you can just copy either your existing base or somebody else's layout, assuming that you have the permission for it, and then you can just place it down outright in a different location. Again, you will also need to have the resources for that. Or you can sell said blueprints to an exchange, as they've confirmed that in the Q&A session. The exchange is basically the in-game auction house, so you can transaction that and trade it with other players, either for other blueprints or in exchange of the in-game money. So you can sell those designs, but one thing they answered is that once the blueprint gets consumed, it's gone for good, so you cannot replicate it. This means you pretty much have to create another one if you want to go through the whole process once again. Among some of the other info they mentioned is that they've also confirmed that combining faction building sets is also possible, which got me quite excited because this confirms a few other things. So for example, if you want to combine the Atreides and Harkonnen aesthetics, you definitely can, and you can mix and match different building sets from each one of these, which implies that we can indeed progress in the reputation of multiple factions at the same time, or at the very least progress in one of them, but not be restricted to progress in another one later down the line. However, there were some limitations mentioned to this, so they did mention that on one side, this is not going to be easy to pull off. Another thing that was mentioned is that still factions will have unique pieces that require you to fully dedicate yourself to that faction, so I'm assuming that to max out one faction, you cannot do it for both at the same time. And third of all, your reputation may be affected with one or the other, as you're technically going to be considered somewhat of a traitor of the cause if you switch sides, though they haven't expanded fully upon that for spoiler reasons. But it sounds interesting. At the very least, it kind of highlights maybe the possibility of us to switch sides in case we don't like the current one we just chose. Also, speaking about the factions, besides the Atreides and Harkonnen, there is a third faction that's going to eventually get introduced to prevent situations where one side completely dominates the server, because as you may or may not know, there are going to be some faction wars in one way or another. By the looks of it, this will get added after launch to balance existing factions with unique mechanics centered around the whole idea of balancing the whole trio and whatnot. In terms of everything else, obviously there are some big bonuses over here to what we can do in terms of all the faction related stuff, because there are two systems over here that I really think they will change the game up. So this is the exchange and the Landsraad, which is basically the political system. So in terms of the exchange, think of this as the game in-game driven auction house. It's a global system that allows you to buy and sell items like building sets, resource charts, also those schematics and blueprints we talked about across different servers. And you can access these typically from the social hubs only. So for example, Hako Village and Arakan, these are the only two locations that were mentioned. I'm not sure if there is going to be any other social hub besides these. However, the Landsraad, which is basically the political system, sounds even more interesting, and you can probably make some comparisons with the faction wars from New World, for example, this system involves pretty much player factions competing for political influence through votes in the game, and players can earn votes for their chosen faction by completing tasks for various houses. A bit like New World, like I said, but in a more PvE manner, though PvP is not excluded, where the winning faction gets to implement its own decrees server-wide, or maybe even possibly game-wide. So stuff such as unlocking special vendors for those factions that won, reducing crafting costs for them, or enabling full loot PvP in certain specific areas. And each guild casts votes on these decrees depending on the votes that they get, and the votes that they get will be weighted by the contribution they had at completing those faction tasks we just talked about. Additionally, individual players also receive personal rewards upon winning for their respective factions, such as resources, schematics, cosmetics from those houses, and so on. And it sounds like a very interesting system and an interactive way to bring the community together. However, I do have some concerns because I've literally seen this unfolding within the first weeks when New World launched. I'm not sure how it fares nowadays because I haven't kept up, so let me know down below in the comments. But eventually, it devolved into single factions literally dominating the same servers for weeks, if not months at an end. And pretty much everybody from other factions eventually abandoned their own to join the one that was winning. So unless they find a way to perfectly balance that out among multiple servers, I'm not sure exactly how they can prevent that from literally happening in this game as well. Now, Funcom did promise that there are plans to expand this with more activities and decrease over time. However, this won't be available in the beta phase. Just so you know, this system will be only available on launch. Now, in terms of post-launch content, one thing I really enjoyed is that they were full transparent of what their future plans are in terms of the business model. You can also check the video out. But basically, there's not going to be an early access for this, nor monthly subscriptions. There are going to be regular free content updates, which will expand on the story with new features, new content, and quality of life improvements. And each major update will also get to release optional DLCs that, from the sound of it, are paid. So you can either buy them standalone, whichever you want, but they may also be included in season passes that can include multiple DLCs that you can go ahead and purchase. And besides this, another paid thing I would say is the 5 days head start that will eventually put you in a pretty great advantage. But from the looks of it, they will have servers, fresh servers on the game launch to kind of bypass some of the head start that other folks have. Now, on a final note, I kind of have 2 more objections, I would say. You can totally go ahead and, by the way, check out the character benchmark and character creation mode. You can see how your system will handle the game on Steam. But one other thing that I wanted to also cover is that I'm still not completely certain how they will handle some of the general jankiness of the game. Of course, jankiness in games like these is expected. I still think the gameplay loop is fun. It's just that melee combat was quite disappointing. It definitely didn't feel as fun and fluid as it should. However, what compensates for that in terms of combat is some of the weapon and gunplay. That definitely felt quite fun. Some of the powers also seemed intriguing, and you can combine them with one another in interesting ways. We're going to talk that in the full video, and given the fact that you can eventually have access to all of the classes, you can definitely make some really interesting combinations, like using anti-gravity fields to put yourself up in the air and get high ground, or just distract your opponent in one way or another, or bring them out of cover. These are just a few of them, but there are many other options in there that we're going to talk about once we get closer to launch, and also once we check out the demo. But for now, gunplay definitely felt way more solid than that melee combat ever did, and I'm not sure they will have any chance to improve it significantly, since literally that's how the game plays. But we're gonna see more of the game on the 9th when folks will finally get their own impressions about it. Again, I have those 20 keys, so if you want to get a chance at playing the game early, just leave a comment down below and make sure that you're a subscriber so I know that you want to participate. I'm gonna try to get as many keys as I can to get a lot of folks in the beta as soon as possible. This is it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.